So I guess first off, someone want to define anthropology for me? As a biologist, I have kind of a idea, but somebody want to define it?
Come on, guys.
Study of humans.
Study of humans? Okay.
Time, space.
Okay. Well, my research focuses on the influence of humans over time and space. So it's very closely related to anthropology, even though I'm not looking at cultural and societal changes, but I'm looking at the influences of culture and society on landscapes. So most of my research follows this idea that we have environment around us. We as humans can't leave well enough alone, so we have to change it. And then when we change it, what happens to everything else that's there? And I did throw this together as rural and urban because I do a little bit of looking at how urban ecosystems change and how what we do in cities and suburban areas change the land around us. And then also most of it is rural. What do we do with agriculture and how does that then influence all of the biological communities that are around these agricultural settings? And I wish I'd brought a clicker with me, but. So most of my research, or all of my research, has this center on plant biology. I'm a plant biologist, I'm a botanist. I look at how plant communities are organized, how they interact with each other, and from that I look at a lot of distribution of plants, where they're at, and kind of looking at then the influence of invasive species, which are species that shouldn't be here, but we as humans can't leave well enough alone. We pick them up and we move them to new places and introduce them, and they cause all kinds of problems when dealing with our native species. And then it all comes down to how do plants deal with stress? How do they deal with shade? How do they deal with drought? How do they deal with the different kind of components that they need in order to survive? And then how does that influence distribution? And how does that influence the interactions with invasive species? So, thinking about habitat fragmentation, who can define what habitat is? What is habitat? Anybody?
Environment in which something lives.
It's the environment in which something lives. So it includes the space it needs. It's the light a plant needs, the water, the prey that an animal needs to eat. It's everything that organism, that living thing needs in order to survive. So then we've got habitat. What's fragmentation? What do you think it means? Breaking it up. So habitat fragmentation is a process that leads to discontinuous habitat. We have continuous habitat, and then we start fragmenting it, we break it apart, we make it smaller, we separate it somehow. So we do have natural fragmentation that's following geological events. So this is over geological time. We have fragmentation of habitat. It separates, it changes. It's very slow. What happens, do you think, when we have slow fragmentation over geological time? What happens to the organisms, you think? They adapt, they evolve. That's how we get speciation. That's how we get separation of different species in these habitats. So natural fragmentation is important to evolution. Artificial fragmentation is what we do as humans, and we have anthropogenic events that are happening in very short periods of geological time. So we're talking over the last 100 years, 200 years, even in the last decade, what has changed in terms of connection between habitat patches. So what do you think happens with fast fragmentation? So it disrupts how they interact. What else do you think happens? Extinction, loss of species. So with fast fragmentation, which is what we do, we start losing species. So when we have fragmentation, we have changes in the area, the size of the habitat. We have increases in distance to the next habitat, so that connectivity and isolation increases. And then we have edge-interior ratios change. Edge is being impacted by whatever's around it. Interior usually has a very special value to it, and interior doesn't have those effects from outside. So as we start fragmenting the habitat, we get more edge and less interior. And for some species, that's essential. Interior habitat for really rare species is usually very important for their survival. So we start off with a large continuous patch, and as we start fragmenting it, we start building these distances, this isolation between habitat patches. We get more edge and less interior, and the overall area just decreases. And we can get to a point where we have these really small patches that have absolutely no interior. They're all edge habitat because they're always receiving influence from outside. So fragmentation starts causing these major changes to whatever's living there. And we apply this theory of island biogeography. We know what islands are. Biogeography is just looking at the distribution of plants and animals, where they occur on Earth, and how we can explain geographically where they're located. And so island biogeography has some underlying ideas and theories that we apply then when we start looking at fragmentation, that as islands are closer to the mainland, we see more species. We have our mainland, we have a close island, we have a far island. As that distance increases, the number of species usually decreases because it's easy for a plant, an animal, to move out to the island and colonize from the mainland when it's a short distance. Islands that are larger have more species than islands that are small. Again, it's a colonization. Can they see it? Can they get to it? And then in the big islands, we have lots of little microhabitats. We've got little patches of habitat that's suitable for very specialized species, and there's a broad range of habitat available to lots of different species. And then older islands typically have more species than young islands because they've been around longer. They've had more time to be colonized. It takes a while. When we go through and have a new island created from a volcano, it takes a long time for species to get there. There's some very important classical island biogeography research that was done at Harvard, where they went in and basically nuked the entire island and removed all of the insects off the island, and then looked at how quickly do insects then come back. And something we would never be able to do now, but they just pesticide bombed the entire islands and looked at what came back. So we actually have research that supports these ideas and gives us an understanding of what's happening on islands. And most of the time, we think about islands as being an island surrounded by water. It's a patch of habitat surrounded by a matrix of unsuitable land. So we can think about that as forests surrounded by agriculture. We can think about it as a prairie surrounded by forests. We can think about it as land surrounded by water. We could also think about it as water surrounded by land, as a pond or a lake. So there's multiple ways to think about what is an island and what does fragmentation do, and how do species then respond to that change. So basics of fragmentation and biogeography. And one way that we cause fragmentation is simply changing how the land is used. What did we do to forests in terms of changing land cover? We turned it into agriculture. We turned it into urban. We turned it into suburban land. One of the things, though, is that if you look at this map, this is Allen County. Black basically is no change over a 10-year period. This is 2001 to 2011. Red is change towards urban and suburban. There actually are some little blue dots, which are changes to water. So they were ponds and basically drainage areas that were dammed up and made into ponds and lakes. But for Allen County, almost all of the change is urban and suburban development. There's very little, if any, actually there's no change from agriculture to forest or forest to agriculture. We've done this already. Everything has been changed to agriculture that we're going to keep in agriculture. Now we're starting to turn agriculture back to suburban and urban development. So we change habitat, we cause fragmentation by changing the cover types, what the land is used for. Before European settlement, about 85% of Indiana was forested. Continuous forest from one end of the state to the other, obviously before it was a state. So we've got almost 20 million acres of forest before European settlement. Between 1800 and 1870, 700 acres of forest were cut every single day. Think about that. Every single day, 700 acres. And this was before invention of, or the widespread use and invention of crosscut saws. So they're cutting these acres down with just axe. What also happened between 1800 and 1870 in Indiana? What's that?
Lots of people and animals.
Lots of people and animals. For Indiana, what happened during that time? Became a state. So we have a whole big change of everything happening during this time. We have going from a territory to a state, going from almost no people to a really large population of people, cutting down all these forests, and we go from almost 20 million acres of forest to less than 2 million acres. So going from 85% to less than 8% forest. In that time period also, we went from being a territory to a state to one of the leading states in hardwood production. We were producing so much wood out of these forests that we became leaders of hardwood production to a point where we basically used up everything and we were no longer leading that. By 1967, we have doubled that forest back to about 16% of the state, and now we're about 5 million acres. And again, we're not changing that dramatically anymore. It's basically what's forest is going to stay forest, what's agriculture is going to stay agriculture. We're not changing that in any large scale way anymore. So most of everything that I do research-wise is looking at, okay, what happened 100 years ago, how did we change everything, and how is it now? And what happened to those plant communities and those insect communities and everything that's living in these patches. This is Wells County. Decatur is over here on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can see these really dark squares. What do you think those are? Those are forests. Those are the remnants of this continuous forest that existed across Indiana. Everything else in between is agriculture. All those big squares, those are fields, those are ag fields, row crops, corn, soybeans, pastures, those type of things. So we have these little bitty islands of forest. Some are close together, others are farther apart, and we can start applying island biogeography theory to what's happening in these forests, which is what one of my grad students did. So most of these studies, well, 2 of these studies are from grad students, a couple are from undergrads that have done some research in my lab, and these are kind of the results of what we've looked at. So this grad student was looking at plant communities, looking at those islands of forest, and how are those plant communities organized in relation to the islands of forest that we have. So we've got agriculture surrounding these forests. What is the influence of those fragments on the plant communities? Wells, Adams, Allen County, and we have those little pockets of forest. The little green specks are all the forests that we have in those 3 counties. Anybody know what that is? Big block of forest in northern Allen County? No, not Chain Lake. It's Cedar Creek. So it's the Cedar Creek corridor where Acres Land Trust and there's a Girl Scout camp that have basically protected these large sections of forest along Cedar Creek. And that's the biggest forests we have in northern Indiana. So my student Rachel was looking at Adams, Allen, and Wells, and really we were just looking at this little block of Allen. We didn't care about the rest because we have Fort Wayne, we have lots of urban development, so that kind of influenced our forest selection. And we looked at plants in different layers. So we looked at the plants that are close to the ground, plants that are in the middle layers, and then the overstory plants, which are the trees that make the 3-dimensional space that is a forest. And so we looked at those 3 layers and then looked at how does the spatial organization of that forest influence those communities? How does the size of the forest? How does the perimeter area ratio, which is a measure of complexity of the shape? So a circle has a low perimeter area ratio, whereas a really L-shaped forest would have a higher perimeter area. It's more complex shape. And we looked at some other things like age of the forest and distance to the nearest neighbors of forests and how many forests were in 1 and 2 kilometer circles around those forests. Just thinking about Adams County and Wells County and the number of forests. So all those little specks were forests, and there's over 2,000 individual forests in those counties. And those are all privately owned, except for a few state parks and a few acres properties. The vast majority are private individuals owning these forests. And they account for 5% of the counties themselves. Everything else is developed in agriculture. 86%, 85% is agriculture in these counties, whereas there's a little bit of urban development, and then there's a little bit of forest, and that's it. Oh, and these are all used, since they're all privately owned, they get used very differently. There were some forests we'd go into and we'd find old trucks. We'd find forests where they actually drove their lawnmowers through the forest and basically made this turf grass, tree, savanna type forest, which was really odd. We see different ages. Just by looking at this, we can see that this is actually an older forest because there's very little in terms of plants on the bottom and in the middle, whereas this is a younger forest because we've got lots of layers, very complex forest because it's lots of light coming in and lots of plants growing. And we can also see things like this area here where there's very few plants in the understory, that would flood on a regular basis. So we can see completely different types of forests and shapes of forests just by walking through and not even doing any kind of data collection. So here's our forests. These little bitty dots are the forests that we were working with. The student lived in Decatur, so that's why we radiated out from there for ease of travel. Once we had all that data, we can do some spatial analysis. And the interesting thing that we found, so this is understory, midstory, and overstory. This analysis basically gives us an idea of the dissimilarity between the individual forests. So each dot is a forest. And when they're close together and these circles kind of overlap, we get an idea that these forests, even though we're looking at very distinct locations, they're all very similar in the community structure. So the types of plants that are there, the amount of those plants, they're all very, very similar. Same in midstory, and same for overstory. And it's likely because these all came from the same continuous forest. Historically, these would have been part of the same forest the whole time. So very little dissimilarity. It's just semantics of dealing with statistics. We don't say that they are similar, we say they're just not dissimilar. So they would have been part of that once continuous forest. And so we could start looking at this as how do these individual patches kind of relate to each other, and didn't have to look at them within county. We didn't have to say, okay, this is what happened in Adams County, this is what happened in Wells County, this is what happened in Allen. We can just talk about this fact that we have all of this change happening in these forests. So looking at plants, looking at the number of plants, forest area, overstory diversity, we saw increases in the numbers of the understory plants, which aligns with the island biogeography theory. And that as the island got bigger, we found more species. And overstory diversity gives us an idea that there's more of those little microhabitats. So it kind of follows that theory and explaining why these communities might be reacting in different ways. Same with midstory. Forest area and overstory diversity increased the number of those plants. And then harvesting was something that we looked at because these were all privately owned forests. Some of the landowners had gone in and cut down trees. And so we added that into our analysis, and we saw that as harvesting occurred in the last 20 years, we had more mid-story species, which is what we'd expect, because if you take out trees and you open up light and reduce the shade, and more then trees come up into the mid-story, and there's a whole process of recruitment that occurs in these forests because of that harvesting. So changing the forest, changing the age actually started manipulating what we saw. With diversity, which is kind of a measure of the complexity of the community, we can see perimeter and canopy cover caused some increase in understory species, but as the forests got older, we had fewer and fewer complex communities, which is expected. We kind of expect that to happen with plants, which is the inverse of island biogeography theory, in that as they get older, we expect them to have more species, but in plant communities, we see this as a common thing. As the forest gets older, we start seeing fewer and fewer distinct communities. This one was interesting. We didn't expect to see this with more forests in a kilometer, so more connectivity and less isolation. We actually saw fewer species in the forest. Not sure exactly what was happening there, but you would expect that if there's more connection, less isolation, we would expect to see more species occurring in there. We didn't see that. And then Floristic Quality Index is a kind of a measure of pre-settlement. So if we have a high FQI, we expect it to be very similar to what was there before European settlement. And if it's really low, we expect it to be very different. And we saw that as our forest islands got bigger, we saw a higher FQI, which means they started having more interior, which likely means they were less disturbed, they were more stable, and we started seeing plants that should be similar to pre-settlement in these forests. So very different kind of reactions to these communities based on these different characteristics in the forests. I had an undergrad take the data from that study and then start looking at seeds and how those seeds spread, how those plants move, because the only time a plant really moves is when the seeds are being dispersed by an animal or the wind. So using the species list and then a database that has most species in the world, a list of their seed mass and how they move, I had a student work on looking at these communities. And she was able to show what we expected to see, and that animals are the dispersal mechanisms for really heavy seeds. Lighter seeds get moved by the wind, and really, really light seeds are unassisted. They just fall off the plant and that's it. And we found in the understory, animals animal dispersed plants were more abundant than any of the others. Which animals are directing dispersal. They're moving seeds to where the plant wants to be anyways, so that's kind of expected. So that was understory. And then if we look at those fragment characteristics, so here's forest area and abundance. As the forests got bigger, this is animal dispersed seeds, their abundance actually decreased. And that is something we don't really know for sure why it really influenced the abundance that way. But we do see perimeter area as it increases. So this is again that measure of kind of complexity of the shape. Their abundance increases as perimeter area increases. So our thought is that we have an oddly shaped forest, animals running along with seeds either in its fur or in its gut, and a complex shaped forest has more edges that animal can go into. And so the likelihood maybe is that as an animal's moving across an ag field, it goes into a forest when it finds an edge, and then it drops off the seeds, and we start seeing more of those type of plants because there's more edges to catch those animals. Mid-story, same kind of picture where we have animal dispersed seeds are heavier, but we saw the flip side of that in our abundance, and that wind dispersed seeds were more abundant in the mid-story than animal dispersed seeds. And don't know really exactly why that is. There just may be more wind dispersed species in the mid-story than animal dispersed. But again, we had heavier seeds dispersed by animals. Forest area with our negative relationship with abundance for the wind dispersed plants. This makes sense because as we get bigger forests, we get more interior and there's less edge effect. And so as the wind is blowing through a forest, when it hits that interior, it slows down. Those wind dispersed seeds can't get into those forests as easily. And so we start seeing fewer and fewer of those plants inside the forest because it's big and there's an interior that's blocking that movement. But both wind and animals in the mid-story do increase in abundance as the perimeter area increases. So again, as we get more edges, we see more edges for those animals and the wind seeds to move into and get caught, and then we see more of those plants. So we see some relationships there that we kind of can easily interpret. We see relationships there that we really have no clue why those relationships exist in terms of animal plants in the understory decreasing as size increases of the forest. So those are looking at forests as islands and what happens to the species of plants and the group of plants that are living in that forest when we look at size and shape. This is the urban side of looking at fragmentation, and as we change those different patches, then we start changing what happens figuratively and literally what happens downstream. And so this Rachel, I've had this propensity to have Rachels in my lab. She looked at algae in streams downstream from different land use categories. So how does the land around a stream influence what's happening in that body of water? So she was working in Huntington Wells in Adams County. These are streams that are present continuously all year. They don't dry up in the summer. We avoided those kind of ephemeral streams for this project. So as runoff from ag fields, from parking lots, from lawns, as that water moves off of the land, it moves into a stream and carries with it any nutrients that it's collected along the way. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the most important because those are the things we put into our fertilizer that goes onto an agricultural field or our lawn. No matter what, if we fertilize, we're putting those kind of chemicals onto, or those nutrients onto the field. Whenever we have those nutrients going into the stream, now we have food for the algae. They start growing, they start reproducing, and as we get blooms, so we get these big explosions, figurative explosions of algae in the streams and lakes, they start feeding and they grow and eventually they die, and when they die they start to decompose and they use up all the oxygen in the water. And when they use up all the oxygen, then fish start to die. We get dead zones in places like Lake Erie, where the Maumee reaches Lake Erie. There's a dead zone there where lots of fish die because of algal blooms that explode there because they've had so much runoff from agricultural fields going down the Maumee towards Lake Erie. So with this project, our question was, how do those little fragments of land adjacent to the stream influence what's happening in the stream? How can we predict what to expect to see in the algae communities? So our streams varied in size. We had big things like the Wabash, and we have lots of trees around it, very natural kind of landscape around the stream. We had very artificial landscape where this is a channeled ditch, and there's ag fields on both sides of the ditch. There's very little in the way of kind of complex plant communities. It's all grasses right up to the water and up to the agricultural field. But what we found was that in the stream, the number of algae species increased with open land development and pastures. And open development is turf grass. It's yards, it's sports fields, it's parks, it's golf courses, those kind of open areas that are clearly not natural, that are just grass that we fertilize and mow. And then pastures are going to be old agricultural fields typically. They've overgrown, they're not used for really much of anything. We don't do a whole lot of livestock agriculture in Indiana, but we do some. But richness was negatively influenced by woody wetlands. So having these forested areas right next to the stream that can flood, we found there was less algae growing in those streams when those wetlands were preserved, when they existed. Wetlands are the kidneys of the landscape. They filter the water. They filter out those nutrients, allow it to settle out, allow it to move into the soil instead of going straight into the river or stream. So by having those wetlands there, it slows down the water, absorbs the nutrients. We also measured biomass, which is a measure of growth of the algae. And again, with open development and low development, so here we've got some impervious land, so parking lots, those type of things, sidewalks. As those increased, we saw an increase in growth of algae because the water's moving in, it's taking nutrients with it. But we also saw grasslands, which are kind of closely related to pastures. This is not turf grass. Open development is turf grass. This is more this kind of grass. And then kind of shrubby, scrubby areas. Again, overgrown agricultural land that's kind of left to start fending for itself. And we saw biomass decrease as emergent wetlands. These are not forested wetlands, but the kind of wetlands we think about, like at Eagle Marsh. Those type of wetlands have, again, that ability to filter the water. They allow those nutrients to come out of the water and are not then putting those into the streams. So here, having these little patches of fragments of wetlands benefited the stream. And when we've changed everything to these open development and high development areas, we start seeing dramatic change in the stream quality, which down the stream, when we go down towards the Maumee, towards Lake Erie, or down the Mississippi towards the Gulf Coast, we see major issues with the amount of nutrients that end up in these rivers. So having these fragments there, even though they are still fragments, are still important. So current grad student is working on looking at prairies, which are grasslands, have fires, they have very specialized plants that grow there. And his project has looked at some different management strategies for invasive species, those things that aren't native, that have been moved here by people and are causing problems because they change what native plants and animals can use. So in Indiana, we don't really have a whole lot of prairies. The only natural prairies that we really have are in the western part of the state. Kankakee Sands, which is a Nature Conservancy property, is a natural native prairie. It's just a little bitty finger that comes into Newton County from Illinois. So there's not a whole lot of real natural prairies in Indiana. Most everything that we have that is a prairie, that we manage as prairie, they're artificial. They're byproducts of agriculture. We've got land that no longer we want to keep in agriculture. We convert it to a prairie because it's easier than trying to grow a forest, because we can do this very quickly and easily. So this is the site that we've worked in. This is Arrowhead Prairie, which is on the southwest side of town. It is a tall grass prairie. In the middle of the summer, it is 5-6 feet tall of grasses, but it is artificial. It's a small prairie that should not exist there and only exists there because we built it there. But it's still important. Key species like Henslow Sparrows, which is Henslow Sparrow, which is state endangered, uses Arrowhead Prairie. Even though it's a really small prairie, it's a small grassland, it's still, this bird still uses it as a place for nesting and for raising its young. So it is important. And so we've created the islands where they never would have occurred before. At least with the forest islands, there were forests there and we just separated them. With these prairie islands, we've created islands that are not even connected to anything else related to them, just because we have these fields that we no longer want to plow. But we get to set them on fire. So this is a fire in Arrowhead Prairie in May, I think this is 2014 burn. And it's a small area, but by burning it, we remove all of the extra plant material that's there. We get rid of all that extra stuff, this brown grass over here. This is what that all looked like, and set it on fire. The fire moves very quickly, burns it all up, and is a necessary management strategy to keep prairie plants in these fields. And the goal then is to remove these trees by setting them on fire, because trees don't like fire, usually. So you burn them up, we get rid of them, and so you rapidly remove plant material from the site. The goal of a fire is to consume everything above ground, but leave everything underground intact. we want to keep the soil alive. We want to keep the bacteria there. We want to keep the fungi there. We want to keep the plant roots and seeds there because we want then the next group of plants to come back very quickly. And what happened was these pear trees are invading the prairie. And the goal was, can we burn this off and get rid of the pear trees? The answer was no, because it top killed the trees, so everything above ground did die, but the roots were left intact, because that's the goal of the fire, is to leave everything below ground intact. The problem then was that the trees all sprouted, and we had 3 times as many stems coming back. Every single tree that we measured had re-sprouted at least once, if not some of them 5, 6 times. So we had all these new stems coming up. So not a good strategy for controlling the tree. It's necessary for the field, but it's not a good way to control these trees. So we're dealing with a very small prairie. It's only 27 hectares, which is a very small area of land. And we measured temperatures when the fire moved through, and we got temperatures that were what we'd expect for a prairie. Even though it's small, the fire doesn't behave the same way as it would in a very large prairie, but it still gave us average temperatures that were within kind of the ranges that we see in Great Plains. So in areas where we have really big grasslands that are continuous, when those burn, average from 100 to almost 400 degrees Celsius, we were right in the middle of that, which we were glad to see. Our differences, though, were that our maximum temperature was 253 degrees, whereas in the Great Plains, maximums are almost 700 to 900 degrees Celsius. So there are places in these fires that get really, really hot, and we did not experience those. And our measurable maximum was just at 538. So we couldn't even measure at some of those maximums that they experienced in the Great Plains. So we've got these little islands that we've created that are not connected to anything else, but they're still really important. And then finally, last project that I've got going on, this is a grad student who's just starting her master's, looking at those same kind of forest ideas, those fragments of forest in Indiana, but how does that then influence the insects that are in those forests? How do those respond? Because we kind of have an idea now how the plants might respond, but how do the insects respond to those different changes? So instead of going south to Adams and Wells again, we're going north to Steuben and Noble and Whitley counties. And this is something that she's going to be starting this summer. And again, we're looking at the same kind of island biogeography characteristics, so size and shape, distance to other forests, and that connectivity isolation idea. But now we're just looking at what do the insects do in those forests. We have slightly more controlled, because with the plant study, we were looking at privately owned forests that all have different management strategies, all have completely different goals by the landowners. And here we're looking at forests that are all owned by Acres Land Trust. So we now have a little bit more control over protection, the types of things that are happening in these forests. We have more history about what has happened in the past, because Acres keeps good records of what they've got, and when landowners hand over their land to Acres, donate it to Acres, and Acres purchase it, they get more information about what has happened there. So we'll have a little bit more information about what has happened in the past and what is driving these differences between the forests, and just understanding our impacts as humans. So my research questions that I keep going back to are what are those spatial, how in space and time does the shape and structure of a forest influence what's living in the forest? How do our changes to those fragments then influence everything that's outside of the forest, or outside of our development and downstreams and in agricultural fields and in prairies? And then how important are those fragments to maintaining communities? One thing I didn't talk about was a project for one of my classes that I teach, a field botany class. We were able to find a forest in New Haven that's a very rare kind of forest type in Indiana, northern Indiana. And so can't say unique. One of our reviewers did not like us using the word unique. But it's an uncommon forest type that we should maintain, because it has a very special type of plant community that's living there. So how important are these fragments? And then the big question that everything kind of comes back to, that I'll probably spend my entire career trying to answer, is how small can a fragment be to still be that habitat? At what point does a forest no longer become a forest because it's so small that it's just a group of trees? At what point is it just a field of grasses and is no longer actually a prairie? What are the mechanisms that make it really be that habitat, even if it's tiny kind of fragment? This is the lab marshmallow. This is Fogwell, which is an acres land trust property. And this forest here has been protected for 80-something years. It was put into a special state program in the 30s, has been protected. And what we find there is an old forest that has a very high FQI, so it's very similar to pre-settlement plant communities. It's a very special forest, both ecologically because of that, but it's also very special historically because the first state forester was the one that actually went and put it into that program, and it's Charles Deem, who's a very important botanist for the history of Indiana. And so he was there, and it's a very historical place for botany. So Fogwell Nature Preserve and is nice trails that go through the forest and through the prairie here. So that's my research, or a large portion of my research. Any questions, thoughts, discussion, disagreements, arguments? Yes?
I just want, the algae
Yes.
that was growing amongst the
In the stream?
streams.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder how that collects. Do you guys study that?
Most of it's mobile swimming algae. It's not necessarily stationary algae. It's just kind of in the water column. So they have little hairs that allow them to swim, and there are some that are filamentous, but yeah.
Wasn't sure what kind it was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you elaborate on how you know about the pre-settlement vegetation? Are those from the geolonos?
Partially, but there's been some large-scale work by several important botanists to define, it comes down to disturbance. So plants that are associated with disturbance are typically not associated with those pre-settlement remnant habitats, because of the idea is that there would have been disturbance, but it would have been smaller scale, it would have been less intense. And so the plants that we think of as being associated with those pre-settlement type habitats are less commonly found with disturbance. They're found in the interior of the forest where it's very stable, it's not changing rapidly or any large scale way, and that's where we find those type of plants. So it's just like a categorization of the plant itself, the species itself.
I see. So it's related to successional sequence?
Yeah.
And would you like to elaborate on the proud history that Indiana has with the history
Yeah,
of
so
ecology?
Henry Chandler Cowles wrote some seminal work based on his research at Indiana Dunes. And so my other side of my research, I do work in Indiana Dunes with threatened and endangered plants and looking at pollinators and those type of things. But yeah, we have some very special areas in Indiana Dunes that give rise to a major ecological theory of succession, which is the progression of plant communities. As time passes, the plants change, and that stepwise change is the succession of the plants. And so those plants that have a high FQI that are associated with that pre-settlement habitat are usually late successional species. They're less commonly found with disturbance, whereas the low-value plants are things like that we expect to see along the roadside. When we go through and cut down all the trees, what comes back, those initial plants are low FQI. They're associated with disturbance and less with those remnants of pre-settlement. Yeah.
Yeah, I had owned property years ago that was that I received income for not disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
and it was adjacent to protected wetland areas. I believe it was more those that wouldn't be farmed, but anyway.
Yeah.
But what are the status of such programs?
They still exist.
Do they?
There.
For
This is
forestry and-
So this is a certified forest, and basically, the landowners in the 30s, they got a tax break in terms of property tax by keeping it as a certified forest and not cutting it down. There are wetland reserve programs, which is another one where basically the farmer is allowed to put that land and keep it as a wetland instead of farming it, and they get a tax break. It's not going to be the same as if they took all of the crops off the field and sold the crops, but it gives them some incentive to keep it as a natural
And I
wetland
wondered
and a
if
natural
instead of,
forest. Yeah.
For some, not enough anymore, especially
Oh, I'm sure.
when it comes to forest areas.
And I'm sure the price of corn and ethanol production outweighs the tax benefits of keeping some of that land fallow. So there's two sides to that.
Is eminent domain ever used to take a piece of property that may be habitat for an endangered species?
I don't know of an example, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had been, but I don't know of any examples of that, no. Yeah.
Just curious to know if the FQI or perhaps degree of fragmentation is related to the health, as in like invasive.
We usually try to link to that, but since FQI it's a relative measure and it's unitless, we have to compare it to something. And so when you start comparing them, just because it has a low FQI doesn't mean that it naturally wouldn't have a low FQI. I mean, we make these assumptions that Fogwell Forest has a really high FQI, so that means it has to be protected, and someplace else has a really low FQI, so it doesn't need to be protected, but it's all relative, and that may be what it's supposed to be. So like the forest in New Haven has a really low FQI that we found, but it's a special forest that would inherently have a low FQI anyways, lower than Fogwell. So
what about the ratio of the perimeter to?
That starts to give a little bit of idea of health and function of the forest or the grassland. So there are multiple measures, yeah. So FQI would be one, but then also the ratio of interior to edge, the ratio of invasive non-native plants to native plants would be part of that as well. So there are multiple ways to kind of quantify or get a measure of health of that ecosystem, of that forest.
Is there any literature on the relationship between edge interior and health?
Yeah, there's a lot of work on invasive species, really, on how far they move into a forest, especially. And so if you have lots of edge and very little interior, you expect then the invasive species to move almost all the way in. But if you have a really big forest that has lots of interior, then you expect them to move less into that forest. And we actually, for the first study I talked about, we installed a buffer in where we put our plots for surveying, because we knew there was an edge. We didn't want that edge effect. We wanted to look at what was happening in the interior of the forest, and so we just omitted the edge and just looked at what was happening inside. So yeah, there are relationships there to that. Yeah.
So some invasive species like Dandelion Boot, I mean, it's just everywhere.
Yeah.
It's been everywhere. We don't worry about that. We worry about the ones that choke the native plants, right?
Right.
Like the climbers.
Some of them are climbers, and some of them are,
And,
yeah.
yeah. So like, what kinds of invasive species are in Indiana? Do you know?
There's lots. Yeah, the honeysuckles and buckthorn, autumn olive, those are all woody ones. There's kudzu in the southern part of the state. There's,
That's a good one.
yeah.
For an ex-alcoholic, like somebody trying to keep away from alcohol. Isn't that funny?
I did not know that.
Yeah.
And other plants like purple loosestrife is another one that's really common. And then there's insects like emerald ash borer, which kills ash trees. There's a whole range of species. There's some newer ones that are just colonizing.
Control over.
Some of them, local control. Not we're not going to get rid of them all, but there's some localized control.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was off the-
That's all right. You had a question?
Oh, I guess I was just wondering if you knew of, I know that I understand there's one in Goshen, just kind of what your opinion was on vertical farming, and if you see any of that being integrated into how we're doing agriculture here in Indiana. So I would imagine it would have a pretty big impact on the ecology if it took off.
I think it's probably just like any kind of permaculture or any of those specialty kind of agriculture programs. It's going to exist, but it's not going to take over how agriculture is done in the state. I mean, corn, soybeans, tobacco, and are going to be dominant ones in Indiana and Kentucky and Ohio and Illinois. Yeah, in terms of volume and the return on investment, I mean, that's why I think.
I guess so. That isn't even that idea isn't even taken into account for ecologists.
I mean, it's important for small scale kind of agriculture, but I don't think it's not gonna be widespread enough to cause a change to how we do agriculture in the state. I don't think. But that's my opinion.
I was wondering about the different habitats. So you talked about the prairies and you talked about the forests, and you mentioned the wetlands. What is the history of wetlands in the state? Is this something that is really?
Drained them all.
Oh, okay.
Most of them.
Because I was thinking.
So like Eagle Marsh is a good example, where they put in all kinds of drainage tiles, trying to get all the water off of there. It was agriculture for a while until the Little River Wetlands Project acquired it. And the reason why the farmer gave it up and it was sold to them was because it became not profitable. They couldn't keep the water off of it. And the reason is because Eagle Marsh is the confluence of basically a continental divide. And so half of Eagle Marsh flows to Lake Erie, half of it flows to the Mississippi. And there's so much water that converges there from every place else. There was no way that a farmer could keep it drained. And so the vast majority of wetlands in Indiana have been drained, just like the vast majority of forests have been removed to make way for agriculture. So you put in tiles in the ground, you drain the water off, you put it into a ditch that's straight line, you get it away, so then you can plant crops. So, but the reason we have that is because of glaciation and the way the glaciers kind of scoured the land and created this area that was fairly flat and gave us lots of great farmland. So, anything else? Yeah.
Do you think that urban planners and city developers should take your information into account when designing cities?
Absolutely.
How so?
Should they pay you a lot of money?
They should pay you lots of
consult you?
money to consult on how to do that. Yes, that's right. No, there definitely is a need to be conscious of the environment around development. But I think culturally and societally, there isn't as big of a push to do that. I know there are groups and there is a desire to do that in the most part, but if you talk to the vast majority of the public, they don't always think about what's around them when it comes to what's happening when they build something. So yes, I think they should, but at what scale? You have to take into account too that as humans we have to do things. We can't just sit around and not do things. So we do things. So we build, we grow cities. There are a whole range of things. Yeah, that's a whole other thing to talk about. But yeah, I think, and there are places that do. There are cities that really do take into account what's happening around them when they build and they limit growth but yeah. Yeah.
Don't you think there's a way to just kind of market that to the mainstream then to go, if we worked with the ecological system or the innate environment, it would work with you?
Well, a lot of
architecture
the
for that can be inspired.
A lot of the city's current kind of programs to revitalize the rivers and all that is coming back to this idea of how much did we degrade these rivers, how important are these rivers around us, and how can we get people interested in the rivers. If they're not using the rivers, then they're not going to be interested in any kind of protection or conservation of the water, cleanliness of the water, what's happening around the rivers. But if they're there, if we're using the rivers for recreation, for any kind of cultural programming, then people start becoming interested in how to keep the rivers safe and protect them in some way. So part of the city's development of downtown and push to really use the rivers again is kind of part of that. There's that underlying environmental
Just
kind
being
of...
conscientious about the environment through what we're building and cultivating in a society culturally with architecture, remodeling, upcycling. Those things, I think millennials are really pushing. I think that if even those who aren't millennials, I don't know if you are, really showed them that, they would market that.
I mean, there's always a group of people that push for those environmental conscious decisions. I mean, having an environmental ethic is I mean, a historic kind of part of environmental science with Aldo Leopold and his writings on just proper use of the environment is part of that too. So. There you go. And yurts, yeah. There you go. Any other questions, thoughts?
Well, thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, no problem.